Hey guys, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and it is Sunday, so we are doing breaches of the week. And as always, before I begin with the breaches, I'd like to thank the people that hooked me up with these breaches, sending me messages, tagging me, whatever that was. It's always appreciated. And if you have a breach for me or that you hear about, please feel free to hit me up on any of my social media, and I will definitely give you a shout out. But Jonathan Marsh, Chris Fowlon, Sanders Slidnerink, David Walker, and Tamara Groff. Guys, thank you very much for tagging me, linking me, whatever that was. It's always appreciated. With that, let's begin with an update on Wawa. This is a supermarket chain based out of Pennsylvania, and this past Monday, hackers put up for sale payment card details of more than 30 million Americans and over 1 million foreigners that have used Wawa on Joker's Stash. This is one of the largest, basically fraud forums on the dark web where the buying and selling happens a lot. Now, by virtue of this, studies have started to be done on Wawa, and Gemini Advisory said this, I quote, "Since the breach may have affected over 850 stores and potentially exposed 30 million sets of payment records, it ranks among the largest payment card breaches of 2019 and of all time." This is true. They joined the ranks of Target and Home Depot and others when it comes to payment card breaches, although they are definitely not in first place. So there you go. Next up is Delta Airlines. Now, this was actually sent to me by a colleague, and basically they sent messages out to people, and I quote, "During your recent trip on Tuesday, January 28th, this was when my colleague was traveling, we experienced a system update that may have resulted in your flight details, inclusive of SkyMiles number, being briefly exposed to a small number of fellow customers." In other words, it seems like what Delta had was, if you went to access your information, you might have gotten somebody else's records instead of your own, and that's obviously a very serious issue. Delta says they have fixed it since then. Moving on, let's talk about the United Nations. Now, an internal confidential document from the United Nations leaked to the New Humanitarian, which apparently is a publication, and was seen by the Associated Press, and it says that dozens of servers were compromised at UN offices in Geneva and Vienna. Now, the servers include the Human Rights Office, which has obviously been very much a lightning rod of criticism from a lot of different governments, specifically those that are autocratic, because that is the group in the UN that calls out human rights abuses. Now, according to Human Rights Office spokesperson Rupert Colville, he said, "We were hacked. We faced daily attempts to get into our computer system. This time they managed, but it did not go very far. Nothing confidential was compromised." Now, one UN official told AP that the hack, which was first detected over the summer, appeared to be sophisticated and that the extent of the damage currently remains unclear, especially in terms of personal secret or compromising information that may have been stolen. And so basically this official, who only spoke on the condition of anonymity, said the systems have been reinforced, and apparently this was a flaw in Microsoft SharePoint configuration. I don't know if it was a Microsoft issue or the way they set it up, but the attackers apparently took over 400 gigabytes of data. So the United Nations has been hit. Moving on, we're going to be talking about EWA, or Electronic Warfare Associates. They are a U.S. Department of Defense contractor, and they are about 40 years old or so, and they just suffered a ransomware infection. Now, this infection hit the company last week. Among the systems that had their data encrypted were the company's web servers, and this was visible online. So, in other words, some of what was hit and ransomed was cached in Google search results even a week after the company took down these servers and remediated the problem. So heads up if you have anything to do with EWA. Moving on, let's talk about the University of East Anglia. This goes back to June of 2017. A member of their staff sent a spreadsheet to a group mailing list containing 298 students from the university's School of Art, Media, and American Studies. This is highly sensitive data, though, which made this kind of unusual for those almost 300 people, because it included private medical details, whether they had been victims of sexual assault, if they had suicidal thoughts, and personal family trauma such as bereavements. So obviously this was probably some part of some kind of psychological study. Maybe this is a staff psychiatrist. I don't know. But for those 300, almost 300, the University of East Anglia. That is not a good week at all. Moving on, let's talk about LabCorp because they're back in the news for a data breach. Basically, a security flaw in their website exposed thousands of medical documents, like test results containing sensitive health data. Now, the system appeared to be protected by a password, but part of that website designed to pull patient files from the back end was left exposed. Now, the unprotected web addresses were visible to search engines and then eventually cached by Google, making it accessible basically to anyone who knew where to look or how to Google. The cache results only return one document, but you could manipulate the end result to just basically go up the row and get more documents or go down the row and get more documents. LabCorp says they have now fixed this. Moving on, let's talk about SpiceJet. SpiceJet is one of India's largest privately owned airlines, and they just suffered a data breach involving the details of more than 1 million of their passengers. The security researcher gained access to one of SpiceJet's system by brute forcing the system's very easily guessable password. An unencrypted database backup file on that system contained private information on more than 1.2 million passengers of SpiceJet. That's obviously an issue. SpiceJet says they have fixed it. Moving on, we're going to be talking about PIH Health in California. Personally identifiable information of almost 200,000 current and former patients of this healthcare network may have been compromised following a phishing campaign that successfully targeted employee accounts. According to the full count, 199,548 individuals may have been impacted by this incident. Employee email accounts basically were accessed without authorization between June 11th and June of 18th, and this was discovered on November 12th of last year. So heads up, PIH Health users and employees. Moving on, let's talk about the Arizona Department of Education. They inadvertently discovered some personally identifiable information belonging to empowerment scholarship holders. This is basically, they had a redacted document apparently that they were subjected to public school records here. My notes are a little unclear. So they had a redacted document with that is public record, but they actually failed to secure the integrity of that redaction. And so if you knew what you were doing, you could unredact the document. And here we are. So heads up, Arizona Department of Education, Empowerment Scholarship account holders. Moving on, let's talk about UW Medicine, or the University of Wisconsin Medicine. On December 26, 2018, a patient of UW Medicine Googled their own name and discovered a public file online containing their sensitive medical information. Now, obviously concerned about this, they notified UW Medicine, and they did an internal investigation that determined an employee error 3 weeks earlier left the data of nearly 1 million patients exposed. Since Google had already saved some of these files, UW Medicine has been working with Google to expunge the saved info and prevent it from being accessed by the public. According to UW Medicine, all of the saved data was removed from Google on January 10th, 2019, because again, we are going back to 2018. However, the 974,000 patients whose data was accessible and exposed for most of the month prior to this may still be eligible to pursue compensation. In addition to patient names, the data exposed included medical record numbers, lab tests, lab results, and information on research studies. No medical records, financial data, or social security numbers were exposed in this breach, according to UW Medicine. So heads up there, that's a bit of a mess. Moving on, let's talk about the Meadville Medical Center in Pennsylvania. They began notifying employees on January 23rd about a data breach within their payroll system. Officials suspect an unauthorized third party may have been able to access personal information on some of their employees and dependents. And so heads up to you if you work for Meadville Medical Center. That's all I know. I don't have a total count. Moving on, let's head down under to Perth, Australia, and talk about the Perth Mint. They were targeted by attackers for the second time in 2 years, this time resulting in a data breach that compromised the details of 1,480 visitors to the Mint. The stolen information includes contact details of people who filled out feedback surveys at the depository and included visitor names, email addresses, home addresses, and telephone numbers. So if you have visited the Perth Mint in the last year or so, heads up. Moving on, let's talk about NEC. This is the massive Japanese electronics company. They revealed that attackers had access to their network for quite some time, but that incident occurred several years ago. They are just now coming to light with this. Although it implemented cybersecurity measures that included an unknown malware detection system, the company was unable to detect the initial intrusion, which happened in December of 2016. The attack, according to NEC, was initially discovered in July 2017 when a report from the security company that they contracted basically revealed that there were unauthorized communications between computers on the internal network and external entities, meaning the attackers probably had a command and control set up, or they were exfiltrating data. Now, further compromise was discovered in July of 2018. This is apparently an advanced persistent threat. The company successfully decrypted unauthorized communications between an internal server and an external machine. In total, 27,445 files were accessed, but the company says that no information was leaked. We will see, but that obviously is long-term and really underscores the need to turn around disclosure pretty quickly. Moving on, let's talk about another massive company, United Healthcare. Now, United Healthcare customers in South Carolina specifically may have had their private information exposed in a data breach that happened last year, according to a disclosure this past Friday. First and last names, health plan information, and private medical claims data all could have been compromised, according to United. The health insurance company did not disclose how many of the customers they had actually exposed. Apparently, someone without permission gained access to the member health information through the healthcare provider's portal. And it said in its disclosure it was notified of this incident on December 10th, and the breach happened somewhere between July 30th and November 13th of last year. Social security numbers and financial information were not exposed. So heads up, United Healthcare users or members in South Carolina. Moving on, let's keep it in the healthcare field. Access Health Connecticut. This is the state's health insurance marketplace, announced on Tuesday. The personal information of approximately 1,100 people might have been compromised in a data breach. These affected by the breach will receive an orange envelope in the mail this week, according to Access Health Connecticut. So if you're in Connecticut, watch out for that envelope if you use Access Health. Moving on, let's talk about a company called Social Captain. Now, this is really interesting. They're a social media booting service, apparently, and they help users grow their Instagram follower accounts. And you know where I'm going with this. They leaked thousands of Instagram follower accounts, usernames and passwords, and all of this. Now, according to a TechCrunch report, Social Captain stored passwords of linked Instagram accounts in unencrypted plain text, meaning they weren't hashing the passwords to obfuscate them on the back end. Anybody could have just read your password, plain as simple. And if they were doing any kind of single sign-on with Instagram, now you've got your Social Crunch and your Instagram account completely exposed. Now, a website vulnerability allowed anyone access to any Social Captain user's profile without having to log in and access their Instagram login credentials. They say they fixed it. So here we go. This is basically another account of Facebook not having control of their third-party developers, and they just let these people in and scrape data. It's a mess. So Social Captain users, heads up, your Instagram account is probably compromised. Go change your password. Moving on, let's talk about Microsoft. And they are in the news again. This is actually outside of the disclosure that they had last week. And I quote, "An attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could allow an unprivileged function run by the user to execute code." This is according to Microsoft. And here's what's going on with this. This is actually two different bugs that were found that could be chained together. Now, the first one is basically a software bug that can be pushed to crash a system and escalate that crash to secure user privileges. The second one, in a lack of security on a relatively arbitrary shared service that can be manipulated to break out of a user's own cloud infrastructure and into the common shared hardware. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with basically how the cloud works, let me break it down like this. Assume that the cloud, in this case Microsoft Azure, basically the infrastructure, the hardware that they built is like an apartment. If you are getting a service from Microsoft Azure, you are basically renting an apartment there, and you're sharing the resources of that apartment, the air conditioning, common halls, and all of that. They are supporting you, and the world sees you through a window. You bring the locks, you store whatever you want in your apartment, all this kind of stuff. What these bugs are saying is that they are able to basically look through your window, cause your window to crash and basically have your back door open, and so that they can get into the parts of the apartment building that are shared not just by your apartment, but by everybody else's apartment, which potentially leads to millions of users and thousands of companies having a very serious issue with this. Now, this was discovered by Checkpoint Security. Microsoft has since fixed this issue, but on the scale of 1 to 10, this vulnerability actually received a 10 out of 10 for being an "oh my god, the world is on fire" level. Please fix this immediately, and Microsoft did just that. So heads up to Microsoft Azure users, and in this case probably patients. Microsoft says they have fixed this, but that is a massive problem. And here we go. And we're not done. We've got two big things to talk about first. The first of the last two is Equifax. They are back in the news because, like many breaches, they are now trying to fly under the radar and up their numbers. And so they just bumped it an additional 2.4 million Americans. Now they are saying that these 2.4 million had much less personal information stolen, and that is all I know. But this underscores the point of most data breaches. When you are going through a data breach with a massive company, they are trying to come up with a number that they consider to be reasonable, or let's say in the ballpark, and oftentimes it is absolutely not. Equifax came out with a breach saying that it was 142 million records. They've been upping it by tens of millions of records since 2017. Yahoo did the same thing, starting with 500 million mailboxes hit and slowly raising it up to 3 billion. Dropbox declared 7 million and then upped it to 70 million, something like 5+ years later. This is the way these things work. Equifax affected way more than 142 million. And when that came out that day, I did a video basically saying, don't believe these numbers. They're way higher. And here we go. Another 2.4 million on the Equifax side. And I guarantee you we will see more as the years go on. And finally, let's actually talk about a report from the nonprofit Identity Theft Resource Center that has some numbers for 2019. And I found that this was absolutely fascinating, although I am somewhat skeptical. Now, the number of reported data breaches rose 17% in 2019 as opposed to 2018. Now, the ITRC analysts, which was actually sponsored by CyberScout, also found that there was a roughly 50% drop in the number of overall records exposed in 2019 and a 65% reduction from more than 471 million in 2018 to under 165 million in 2019 in the exposure category of sensitive, personally identifiable information. Now, according to this report, and I quote, "We also saw the rise of a significant new threat, data exposure from unsecured databases, and growth of an existing tactic known as credential surfing, where data thieves use seemingly innocuous information like stolen email addresses and logins to attempt to access various kinds of accounts." Now, here's why I question this, and it's simply this. We basically know that breaches go unreported or very underreported from year to year. What we have seen per FBI statistic is that the time it takes for a company to realize that they've been hit was increased from 142 days to 192 days. This is as of, I want to say, like a year and a half ago. This tells us that attackers are becoming more sophisticated, and companies typically are not keeping up with the pace of negative technological innovation, meaning hacker innovation, in this case in the malicious sense. And by virtue of that, cyber defense strategies are lagging behind. Now, we've also seen an increase in things like SIEM or SIM, Security Information Events Management monitoring, that basically, helps turn around possible attacks to your organization because you are being alerted in real time, or you see the threat coming a lot faster. And so I am a little dubious of this in the sense that I don't think the record count has dropped. We've seen some massive breaches. I talked about Wawa right out of the gate here. But if this is the case, and if these numbers hold true across the board, and I do not know how comprehensive their study was, I think that's a really good sign. I hope that means we are seeing a trend of a lot of organizations and governments finally catching up to all the advancements in cyber defense strategy we've been making from the last decade. As we emerged, at least here in the United States, from the recession, so many companies were behind because they hunkered down and were not spending cash on things like cyber defense, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it right now. But attackers kept innovating. The whole world did. And so we've been playing catch up, and I'm hoping that that tide will be turning. We will see what the CCPA here in the U.S. Says, but again, I don't know the scope of this report, so I am skeptical naturally out of the gate. And so those are your breaches of the week. It was a crazy week. It was a long week. Were you affected? I hope you weren't. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And don't forget to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online. Thanks, guys.